This was Hurricane Carla, back in 1961. A devastating storm that caused millions of dollars in damages all along the upper Texas coast. Large areas around Houston and Galveston were flooded. High tides, shoved in ahead of the storm, inundated some areas that had never flooded before. We haven't had another hurricane of the same force as Carla in 15 years. What would happen if we did? This is Eyewitness News Issues and Answers. Today's guests are the heads of the Houston and Galveston offices of the National Weather Service. Davis Benton is the meteorologist in charge of the Galveston office, and Irvin Volbrecht is the meteorologist in charge of the Houston office. Interviewing our guests today are eyewitness weatherman Ed Brandon and news reporter Dave Ward.
I want to thank you for joining us today on Issues and Answers. Hurricane season, it's something we don't really like to talk about down in this area, but it is upon us again this year, and every year we talk to you about what to do in case one of these things comes barreling in from the Gulf and what type of precautions to make. This year we may be in for one, who knows. It's been 15 years since we have had a major storm, and that's what we're going to talk about today. What would be the difference if a hurricane the size of Carla were to hit today? The difference today is it was, say, 15 years ago, and the key there is land subsidence. We'll get into all of that here in a few minutes. Gentlemen, let me ask you, what are the odds, let's say? What are the chances? We've been very lucky. Are we due for a storm?
Based on strictly records, of course, that's about all we have to go on in predicting the upcoming season. No one can tell you for sure whether this is the season or not, but based on past records, we do get a major storm, or have had a major storm, approximately every 10 years along the upper Texas coast. And so if you want to look at it, the odds, we'd say the odds are 10 to 1 that we will not get one this year.
I see.
What's the longest period the upper Texas coast has ever gone without having a hurricane?
The period was, do you recall offhand? The period was back in, no, it was it ended in 1932, so it was 17 years, somewhere between in the 20s and early 30s. So this is the second longest period, you might say, that we've gone without a major hurricane.
Are we about the only major city along the Gulf Coast area, or the East Coast for that matter, that hasn't been hit by a storm the last 15 years?
Oh, the 60s and 70s have been a very bad period for the Gulf as a whole. It seems as though the 1940s were basically Florida-type storms, the 50s were basically East Coast-type storms, and then we go into the 60s and we have a whole bunch of these things that have hit the Gulf in one place or another. You can begin way down in Mexico with something like Inez and go into Beulah at Brownsville, Celia at Corpus Christi, the Carla at Port O'Connor. You can go into Betsy and Hilda that hit Louisiana so hard. Then you go into Carmen just a very short time ago, and Camille that went in at Gulfport. So the Gulf has really had a very bad time in the 60s and 70s.
Which one of those would you say was the worst? I saw most of those that you're mentioning about, or saw the aftermath of them. To me,
Camille has probably been the worst of the bunch as far as pure force and intensity is concerned. If you want to talk about size, then you're looking at Carla.
Okay, we have some film. Speaking of look at Carla, if we have that ready now, could roll it. We have some film taken in 1961 when Hurricane Carla came ripping ashore around Port O'Connor. And this is old black and white film that's 15 years old. This is what it looked like over at Port Arthur. People boarding up. Now, does it do any good to put tape on windows like this, gentlemen?
Certainly helps some, but it's might help when the pressure begins to expand outside, of course, but it's not no foolproof method, but certainly we don't discourage it.
The one thing I remember about Hurricane Carla was the mass evacuation from this area. People went up into central Texas, up into north Texas. I was in Waco at the time, and every hotel room, every motel was filled. They set up shelters in the National Guard Armory there. This was in Waco, several hundred miles inland. They did the same thing in Fort Worth.
I was in Austin at the time, and I'm sure there were a lot of people in Austin who evacuated from this area to get up there, and the hurricane was not still a hurricane when it got to Austin, but it did cause some very strong winds and heavy rains up there, too.
This could be a very, very major problem this year. If, again, we're comparing with Carla, you're looking at 1961, for example. Look at the tremendous increase in population through this area since 1961. That may have been considered a very mass evacuation, but think of the numbers that would be evacuating during a similar type storm.
Would you say that, Dave, I think you've estimated that there may be as many as 300,000 people along the upper Texas coast who do not know what a hurricane can do to that area and therefore may not be prepared when it happens?
There are 300,000 people that say live within 10 miles of the coast. This includes, of course, Brazoria County, Galveston, Harris, and Chambers, and many more, of course, on up in Port Arthur area. But certainly some of those people have had hurricane experience. But it's been, I think, fairly accurately estimated that 3/4 of the people in this area has very little or no hurricane experience.
And it's very important that they do know what a hurricane is and what it can do.
This gives you some idea right here what Hurricane Carla's winds did in 1961. But the big damage from a hurricane, I guess from almost any hurricane, would be along the shore areas would be the flooding, the high tides. Do you remember how high the tides were in Carla?
They were, they ran about 9.4 feet or something like that along Galveston, and they got in excess of 14 feet in the bay itself. The figure is a little bit variable in Lavaca Bay where it really went in, but it's generally around 21. You'll hear figures anywhere from 21 to 23 feet.
This is some film of the Galveston Weather Bureau back then. Well, it's gone now. I think you're still using those instruments.
The Weather Bureau's not gone, but I hope. But getting back to Carla very briefly, Dave and Ed, a lot of people still have the misconception that we had a direct hit on Carla, and as we all know, of course, the center was 120 miles from Galveston, so you can imagine if the center had to come in, say, the Freeport-Galveston area, we could add at least 5 foot of tides to what we had, and of course, much higher wind. So really, we haven't had a direct hit by a major storm in the Galveston area, you might say, since 1915, except the storms in the 40s, which certainly wouldn't compare with Carla.
And this is damage that was done in Galveston, 120 miles from the center of the storm.
That's right, but again, as Irv pointed out earlier, this was a massive storm, and these type storms don't come along all that often.
If I remember right, there was a picture taken of a radar screen back at that time. We didn't have the satellite picture, of course, but that radar picture superimposed over a map of the Gulf showed that Carla at one time almost filled, the clouds from Carla almost filled the entire Gulf of Mexico.
Yes, just about the whole of it.
It was affecting every station from Key West, Florida to Brownsville, Texas. It was you might say, being affected by Florida's Carla circulation.
Touching just for 1 minute, if I may, on a comment that you made, and I think it was very, very well taken. So many of the new people in the area, and of course there are a tremendous number of these new people, when they think of hurricane, they think of wind. They don't realize that you have other parameters that you've got to consider on these things. The tide, such as we're looking at here, is one. The fantastic rainfall, for example, that you can get out of some of the others. And then you always have the tornado threat.
True, that's true. Tornadoes seem to be spawned out of the squall lines that come through on these things.
Some of these storms seem relatively free of the tornado. Others have a tremendous number. Again, there's a little controversy as to how many you got out of Beulah, but a generally accepted figure is something like 115.
Tornado funnels out of one
I
single
believe a
hurricane.
great deal of the damage done in Corpus Christi during, what was it, Celia? Was
Celia.
tornadoes. The tornado spawned by the hurricane struck the Civic Center down there. Celia
was a rather unique storm. It was a very dry storm as far as rain, and of course it didn't push up the tides all that high, but it was, so I've heard some laymen describe it as a large tornado, and in effect I guess it could be appropriately described that, in that manner, because it was a very tight wound storm. In other words, winds of 180 miles an hour were clocked around Celia, where Carla, I don't believe, reported that higher wind.
Well, we just saw what Carla could do with winds not that high and the tides. What would happen if we had a storm the same size of Carla, let's say, come ashore in virtually the same place this year?
Virtually the same place? You're talking about Port O'Connor?
Mm-hmm.
I would say that we'd have many homes around the Galveston Bay area, and businesses, of course, that would have up to 5 feet or more of water in them than they had in 1961. Due to
5 feet more.
Right, due to land subsidence. But once again, remember, if Carla came in, or that type of storm came in near Galveston, we could add another 5 feet to that. In other words, we're talking about 10 feet higher, not necessarily higher tides, but 10 feet or more of water due to the land subsidence in the Galveston Bay area. This don't include, of course, Galveston Island because it hasn't sunk that much, but certainly around, say, Texas City and Baytown, Kemah, Seabrook area, that's the most vulnerable areas as far as land subsidence.
So that is a major problem that you could...
Very major, and it's a non-ending sort of thing. They just, I'm sure you're familiar with these subsidence figures that have been quoted between the 1943 and the 1973 surveys, where you had about 8 feet of subsidence in the Jaceta City area. And a very recent study completed around the Baytown area is showing a continued subsidence at the rate of about 0.356, roughly a third of a foot a year, that the land continues to subside.
Isn't it true that there are areas in the city of Houston, within the city limits, which were not affected terribly by Carla in 1961, which would today have very high water should the same type storm strike?
For a number of reasons. One, subsidence is one. Another, Harris County is a very strange type of county when you compare it to almost anything else along the coast. You're looking at a county, for example, that's honeycombed with bayous, creeks, waterways, ditches, and what have you. And one of the major concerns, one of my major concerns at least, is a strong type of storm, for example, that would not only bring in a tide up in the bay itself, push the water up the bayous, which it's going to do, have the thing stagnate down to our south somewhere, become a Beulah-type storm, in other words, and then begin to drop all this rainfall.
You can get 15 inches of rain out of a hurricane, right?
That's a normal, more or less a normal, if it's such a thing as normal, but Beulah had up to 30 inches in places where Carla had around 15 inches.
A lot of that depends on how fast the storm is moving. If it's moving extremely slowly, then it's going to dump more water.
Right.
Sure, and it doesn't take much of a storm to do that. Just a very, very minor type of hurricane, one perhaps just barely of hurricane intensity, can deposit all this water. So you don't need a monster.
Let's get into some basics here. What causes a hurricane? Now, they always seem to form in about the same spot down there off South America or sometimes over near the coast of Africa, and they seem to always head this way. Why?
The breeding areas, we might say the primary breeding areas, of course, is the Caribbean and the South Atlantic, but the Gulf, of course, has their share of incipient tropical storms, too. I feel probably the simplest way to put it, you need 3 ingredients for a hurricane to form. Number one, of course, we have to have warm water temperatures, which, of course, we do have in the summer months. Number 2, we have the atmosphere. Hurricanes and cold air don't get along, for example. We've got to have warm air aloft. And, of course, number 3, we've got to have some kind of triggering mechanism to kick these storms off. And that particular number 3 can be caused by several different, like the equatorial front, for example, that's down in the tropics, that causes quite a few to form on it. And we have what we call the easterly wave types of storms that move across the Atlantic that storms form in. In other words, it's instability that kicks these off. And again, hurricanes that form in the Caribbean and the Gulf and the Atlantic, a lot of people get them confused. They think they're a different animal, say, than typhoons in the Pacific. Really, they're the same. They're just different names, really.
One other thing that has always puzzled me, not being a weatherman, Ed could probably tell me this, but I notice on our weathercast at night, the weather goes from left to right. In other words, it comes from the west and goes to the east. Our fronts always come that way and move that way. And yet a hurricane forms down here in the Gulf somewhere, and it moves just to the opposite. It'll move from the south to the northwest, sometimes due west, going, it seems to me, exactly against the flow of all the rest of the weather we get.
It's all due basically to the rotation of the Earth itself. You've got your prevailing westerlies in your more middle type of latitudes. You have your prevailing easterlies down in the equatorial areas. And that's it in a basic sense.
I don't think I understand it quite yet.
It has to do with primary and tertiary circulation.
Primary and tertiary.
Those are nice big words.
Okay, well, just take our word for it, folks. They move usually from the southeast to the northwest, at least when they start out, and then kind of curve back to the north and then northeast, right?
But I think there's an important point to keep in mind on that, and that point would be this. Each and every one of these things has its own peculiar characteristics. Each and every one behaves in its own way. You can take a whole number of tracks and you can say, okay, here's an average. But that's all it is an average. and you're going to find tremendous deviations from this. You can find right in the Gulf, for example, historical tracks where the thing, instead of coming from the southeast to the northwest and then curving north and so on, they've gone just the opposite. They've started on the Florida side and circled down the Texas side.
Mm-hmm.
In your professional opinions, do you think it would be possible if we spent a lot of money, if the federal government spent a lot of money to study hurricanes and their tracks, do you think it would ever be possible to determine where a hurricane is going, or is that something we'll never know? Will we always have to just take it minute by minute and hour by hour?
We've already spent a lot of money, of course, and
Yes.
we are in a much better position today than we were a few years ago, and where we can tell you where they're going, but we're still, of course, a long ways from being telling you that a storm is going to hit a certain land area within 24 hours. But certainly, I think I'm probably biased in this, being a meteorologist, especially working in the hurricane belt. Just one storm, in fact, I think a conservative estimate, the next hurricane that hits the Galveston, Houston area, especially the Carla type storm, would be a more than $1 billion storm. Well, I think we could afford a few dollars to, and of course, as I say, we are spending some money, but it would be money well spent.
What about elimination of hurricanes, cloud seeding, things of that nature when they form? Have they tried that?
This has been going on for a good number of years. I think we're going back into the early 60s, something like the Barbara and Esther storms that were first seeded. But there has been no seeding in recent years, at least in the Atlantic waters, and we throw the Gulf into the Atlantic waters. And there will be none this year again, although they are going to do some experimental work out in the Pacific itself. So there has been some indication that you can reduce the intensity of these things by spreading out the pressure gradient immediately around the center of the storm itself. Weaken it, in other words, you weaken the wind, so you weaken the tide, and you weaken everything else related to it. But results, I think you can generally consider them to be somewhat inconclusive.
Aren't there some people, though, who look at that, some meteorologists, and say maybe we don't want to modify hurricanes because perhaps a hurricane has something to do with the total overall nature or weather around the earth, and if, maybe the reason for hurricanes is to bring a lot of water inland, and if we cut that supply of water
There's a
off.
definite school of thought on that. There are some meteorologists who believe that the hurricane acts as a safety valve of the tropics. In other words, you build up this fantastic amount of energy in the tropics, and somehow or another you've got to get rid of some of this energy. And there are some meteorologists who believe that one of the mechanisms for getting rid of some of that energy is through the hurricane. And heaven knows they do have enough energy.
Yes, that's true. Well, inevitably, it will happen this sometime this summer or in the early fall. There'll be a tropical storm pop up in the Gulf, or a hurricane come up the slot there below Cuba, and we'll all start looking at it on the radar machines and watching it hour by hour. Tell me, Mr. Benton, where do you reach a point now when this thing is coming on a beeline, looks like it's coming right straight for Galveston Island? Where do you reach the point where you say, okay, civil defense, it's time to move. We got to evacuate the island?
It's impossible, Dave, to set up guidelines that say that when a storm is 300 miles south of Galveston, we do this or do that. We have to take them as they come. For example, as Irv can well tell you, that there's no two storms alike. But let's assume, if there's such a thing as a typical storm, there's not, but let's say a major hurricane is approaching or moving into the Gulf. Of course, the first thing, we would go under a hurricane watch probably once the thing moved into the Gulf. And then the next step would be a warning. Evacuation is really the key word, you might say, in the upper coastal areas today because of what we've already talked about, the land subsidence. We would advise or recommend to civil defense and, of course, the other authorities that if they wanted to leave Galveston Island, for example, they would have to get off before the tides exceeded 6 feet because, to me, the most important freeway in Texas is the Gulf Freeway from Houston to Galveston. But they've been working on it 30 years, and of course they're still working on it, and they have a section that's not completed yet that has a lowest spot on it, and that's just south of Lamarck. So we still have that to contend with, but hopefully this will be completed within a matter of a couple of 3 years, I'm told. But in the meantime, we have to advise these people when the storm is still well out in the Gulf. We may have practically calm seas or calm winds around Galveston, but if it looks like it's going to push tides up to 5 feet, say overnight, these people will have to start leaving the day before. So it is a very ticklish, a very delicate problem. Again, we cannot set up guidelines, and I can't sit here today and say when a storm reaches a certain point, we'll ask you to leave. And again, all storms give varying rainfall amounts. In other words, if it was a dry storm, of course, like Celia, we would be in a better position, have a little more option. But if it's a wet storm like Beulah or Carla, of course, we don't have no options.
Now you said 6 feet, a tide of 6 feet, 6 feet above normal?
That's right, just 6 feet above what we call mean sea level. We'll put water over the outgoing lane of the Interstate 45
There near
on the
Lamar.
mainland side of the causeway and
Okay.
near Lamar.
Now, to get out of Galveston, there are really only 3 ways. Interstate 45, the highway that goes over, what is that, San Luis Pass?
San Luis Pass.
The new bridge there, and the ferry boat.
And they close when the tide reaches 5 feet.
The ferry boat's closed down at a 5-foot
Right,
tide.
and San Luis Pass closes probably when more like a 3 or 4 feet. So you only have
So your
one
last
option.
safety valve is the Interstate 45, which would flood at 6 feet over normal tide.
That's right, and they're approximately, with the tourist, hurricane and tourist season, of course, go hand in hand, and we are conceivably talking about 100,000 or more people being trapped, just say on the Galveston and Island and immediate mainland area. Certainly.
Can you estimate how long it might take to evacuate Galveston Island under those circumstances? Would it be
This has
6
been-
hours, 12 hours?
This has been kicked around at several civil defense meetings, and they feel, some of these law enforcement people in Galveston feel like if all these people in Houston that come down there on Sunday can get out in 3 or 4 hours, they feel like they can get them out. But that's, we won't know until it actually comes. But I feel like that with, if they heed the warnings when they're first issued, I feel like that everyone can certainly get out.
What about the tremendous construction that's gone on in Houston since 1961 in Carla? And we're talking about 20 and 30-story office buildings with glass sides, and a lot of buildings that look like even though they might withstand hurricane winds, they won't withstand a piece of driftwood that's blown on a 100-mile-an-hour wind. If a hurricane of the intensity of Carla strikes Galveston, are we going to be looking at a devastated city of Houston after that?
Maybe Celia gave us some answers to that in the Corpus Christi area, because there was at least one very large glass enclosed building that there was just a mass of glass a foot deep on the bottom of this building and scattered around it. And of course, as we look around Houston itself, we see a large number of these very same types of buildings. This too is another matter of concern. All this glass and the wind and the debris being carried by the wind itself.
Getting back to Interstate 45, Dave, if they had asked your opinion, would you have suggested they start working on the outbound lanes of Interstate 45 before the inbound? Seems like they're getting it right into Galveston,
Well,
but they haven't done much on
Of
the...
course, I'm not in the highway construction business, but certainly that would have been on top of my list. Instead of the outbound lane is 2 feet lower than the incoming lane. There is no provision that I know of to get traffic. In fact, it'd be very difficult to get traffic on the outbound lane. I guess it would be possible, but once you get them on, you're going to have the same problem getting them off somewhere up the way. But we have to make our plans that on the lowest lane, which of course is roughly 6 feet. Again, I would like to hasten to add that 9 people out of 10 that lose their lives in hurricanes are caused from the tidal waters. So the wind in Houston would certainly be dangerous and certainly scare the hell out of a lot of people, but they could probably survive, where on the coast or near the coast, you don't have that option. Once you're trapped, the tidal waters come in. It reminds me of the film of Lady Called Camille when it hit the Mississippi coast. They had a hurricane party in a motel there. 25 people decided to ride it out, and 2 people survived, and they were washed out the window.
I hate to bring this up at lunchtime like this, but tell us the story about the people who climbed trees to escape the high waters during either Carla or one of the other storms, and the study that was done, the autopsies that were done on the bodies after that. Remember that?
Yeah, I recall reading something on that, and of course, I'm sure it's a factual that there wasn't much bodies left.
In other words, they climbed the trees to escape the water, but unfortunately, snakes climbed the trees to escape the water also.
They had a lot of competition for the trees.
Yeah, so climbing a tree is out.
That's not the best way to escape a hurricane.
And yet some people did it way back in the 1900 storm in Galveston. So it's a way, but not a very good way.
Well, we're just about to run out of time here, and there are a lot of people who have moved into our area that are new since we've had a hurricane anywhere near. if you could give them one piece of information when they hear a hurricane warning, a hurricane is coming on its way, what would that be? What should they do?
I think you've got to start your actions long before that time. I think you've got to learn some things such as what is your elevation, what are my ways of ingress and egress, how do I get in and out of places, what are my safe routes of travel, do I have safety measures around the house that are readily accessible, do I have such things as portable radios, extra batteries, do I have some containers for water, if I have an invalid in the family, do I have enough medicines for these people? But when the storm, when the watch itself is declared, that's the time to make sure that all of these things are in proper operating condition and that you know exactly where they are.
Okay, now let's say John Smith, like me, for example, has not made any preparation at all. The last thing he's worrying about is a hurricane, and he's not ready at all. What should he do? Bundle the family up and just get out?
It depends on where you're at, of course.
If he lives in a sensitive area, by sensitive I mean particularly with respect to the tides, if he lives in an area that's going to be inundated, I don't think he has much choice. He should get out whether he's got all these materials or not.
There's very few John Smiths, incidentally, along the immediate coast. I think they know pretty well what a hurricane can do, and they recognize that they can very well lose their property, and also they probably will lose their property, and they could lose their lives if they don't evacuate when the word is given. And again, I hasten to add that just because we put out a hurricane warning, don't mean that everybody pack up and leave immediately, because sometimes we may be on a fringe area that the warning, we barely expect minimum hurricane winds or maybe low tides. The key to it is when we recommend evacuation. That's the key word.
I think we may have left the impression with some of the new residents of the area that a hurricane is like a tornado. It strikes before you know that it's even there. It's already gone. But a hurricane is not like a tornado in that you can see it for 100, 200 miles away or even further. And there will be warnings given, and there will be advice given by you, Dave, and by other people along the coast. And the important thing is to take the advice that you're given through the media.
Do you have the hurricane tracking charts for this year yet?
I'm sure we will.
They're on their way, or will be ordered very soon.
Yes.
Could I get in one plug here for hurricane tracking charts also? We have charts available at our Galveston office. Earl will have them at his office too. And feel free, we're not in the mailing business, but anyone feel free to come by. And the Texas Marine Council, incidentally, has put out several good charts this year. They'll be available not for only this area, but along the entire coast, and they will be available at several points, including most weather offices.
I believe
the Department of Economic Geology, with this Marine Council, has put out a really excellent listing, I think, of what you do in the different stages, what you do before the storm, what you do a long time before the storm, what you do when you actually get your watches and your warnings, what you do after the storm. It's an excellent listing.
Along with Texas A&M, they've done some very good work.
Well, we just ran out of time on this program. Gentlemen, I thank you for coming up here to discuss this program, this problem with us, and let's hope we don't have one. But if we do, remember to keep a watch on the hurricane watches, and when there's a warning or a need to evacuate, get out. Thank you for being with us today on Issues and Answers.
This has been Eyewitness News Issues and Answers. The program is pre-recorded.